live. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Facebook Live presentation by the Van Winkle Law Firm. This is the second presentation in an 8-week series of presentations put on by the Van Winkle Law Firm's business group. If you missed last week's incredible presentation by Anderson Ellis and Meredith Silliman in our group, you can go back. There's Meredith. You can go back and access that presentation by going to the Van Winkle Facebook page, which if you're watching this right now, you're very familiar with how to get to. Or you can go to our YouTube channel at any time to watch that prior presentation. And you can also go back, if this is not your first time, you may recall during the late summer and fall last year in 2020, our Trust and Estates group here at Van Winkle did a similar presentation series where they talked about a lot of different things that go into their practice as well. So you can access their past presentations, and they did 16 of them. We're only doing 8, but we're doing our best. You can access those things also on this page and also on the YouTube channel anytime. Now for the really lawyerly stuff. As our colleagues mentioned in prior presentations, and as you probably see in our comments to this presentation, and pretty much anytime you've heard an attorney talk to a large group of people, we have to say things like, our presentation is not intended to be legal advice. So our presentation is not intended to be legal advice. I know it sounds weird coming from an attorney, but that's the case. What we're dealing with here, or we're talking about general ideas based on our experience with general North Carolina and federal law in our capacities as attorneys, but we are obviously not talking about any specific factual circumstances. We're not addressing any of your specific legal questions today. However, if you have specific legal questions and something that we ask is something that you're dealing with, if you don't already have an attorney, feel free to reach out to our group and someone will either be able to help you or at least point you in the right direction. Of course, if you have your own attorney already, go talk to them. They'll answer your specific questions. So today we're just talking about general stuff, and I hope you find it helpful. So now for the more fun stuff that everyone came here and has been waiting on the edge of their seat for, we're going to start talking about the presentation today, and the title there is an LLC Right For Me, which sounds a little bit weird for me to say introducing it, but maybe the longer title is something like is an LLC Right For You, and other musings on entity selection by 2 attorneys at Van Winkle. So speaking of those attorneys, I'm one of them. My name's Ryan Coffield. I'm an attorney at the Van Winkle Law Firm in our business practice group, and I work out of the Asheville office. And I'm joined today by Meredith Silliman. Say hello again, Meredith. She's an associate in our business practice group in our Hendersonville office. So by the power of technology, we come to you today appearing as though we're presenting together. If you guys tuned in last week, you already saw Meredith once, so you're familiar that she's very good at presenting, and I'm going to do my best to try to live up to the bar that she and Anderson set last week. And if you tune in again next week, you'll get to see Meredith again. So she's becoming a little bit of, I guess, a regular on our Facebook page. I might also be here next week, so buckle up. If it's bad this time, it'll be just as bad next time, but we don't think it's going to be that bad. This presentation is going to be a little bit different than last week. Last week, what we saw was Meredith and Anderson both speaking on different parts about how to look at whether you need to hire an attorney when you're considering entering into a contract or you've been presented with a contract. Today, we're going to take a little bit different of a position. What we're going to do is follow kind of a Q&A format. And so Meredith will be providing us with some of the frequently asked questions that we get when we sit down with a client for the first time or a prospective client. And they start wondering, is an LLC right for me? So with that, I will turn the next part over to Meredith so that we can get this thing started.
Great, great. I'm really excited to be with you guys again today. And as Ryan said, I'm just going to sort of give him some questions that we hear on a regular basis when it comes to helping folks with setting up businesses. So the first question we want to start with is, when someone calls and says, I have a great idea for a new business, their next question is, where should I start?
That's an excellent question. What an amazing prompt. That's the great thing about that question is that it's extremely vague and it's extremely broad, and there are a lot of places that you can start. Um, the number one thing that I try to address with clients when they first come up and they talk about I'm starting a business or I'm acquiring a business and I need to form a legal entity, I think, or maybe I don't know yet, is we talk about what you're going to be doing and with whom you're going to be doing it. That's usually the easiest way to kind of suss out what the initial concerns are going to be, what the goals of the client is going to be, and whether forming a legal entity makes sense for them. Um, Among those things that we try to talk about at the beginning are, what are you going to be doing in your business? Where we direct you when it comes to whether to form a legal entity and what type of entity to form. It kind of starts with what you're going to be doing. So if you've got somebody who's opening up a coffee shop, the rest of our conversation is going to be very different from somebody who's starting a tech startup. If you've got multiple owners in your business, if you're coming together with somebody else, our conversation is going to go in a different direction than if it was just you starting out on your own. Um, some other things that come into play are you going to be putting a lot of money into your business? Are you going to be buying a lot of equipment or acquiring land? Or are you going to be sitting down at a computer like many businesses are run today, and the asset that you're contributing is your skill set and your services? So, depending on how much capital you're going to infuse into the company, what kind of assets you might have at risk once you start the company and once you start running it, those types of things can guide our discussion as we move forward. Some other things that come into play, lots of times, everybody's kind of heard the saying, begin with the end in mind. That's a good way to get where you're going um, in a productive manner. And so that's certainly one part of the initial conversation as well. We have folks come to us through incubators, through investment banks, through all kinds of places where we've got folks who they want to start a business, they want to make it highly scalable, they want to grow it quickly, and then they want to get out. So we want to start with, okay, what's your exit strategy? How important is it to you? How quickly are you going to try to achieve an exit? Um, on the other end of the spectrum, we have folks who come and they say, I'm setting up shop and I want to do this for the next 35, 40 years. And so that conversation looks very different as well, where you may have two very similar companies. Depending on the exit strategy, we may set up a different type of entity than we would for one person as we would for another person. The other thing that kind of comes into play just broadly at the beginning is, where is your money coming from? These days, you can sit down with a laptop and you can start a business. It's pretty easy. You don't even need a lawyer. I'm not supposed to say that probably, but you don't even need a lawyer. You can start a business just by sitting down. It may not be the best idea, and that's probably where we come in, but you can do that. And so the funding sources for some may not be that important. Um, Even if you've got a lot of money that's required for acquiring equipment or entering into a lease, buying a building, if that money is coming from the founder, the person who's going to be starting the business and doing the bulk of the work, that kind of entity that fits that scenario might be a little bit different than if you've got someone who has the skill set, has the experience, and they're looking to start their business, but they need funding. And so we may suggest a different type of legal entity if you're seeking funding from, friends, family, from a commercial bank, from venture capital, or from any number of other sources. You may find that a different kind of legal entity will work better for you in some scenarios, depending on where your funding is coming from, where you expect it to come from. And we're not going to talk about it a lot today, but funding sources is something that also triggers. Sometimes people come to us and they talk about forming legal entities that are not for-profit entities. And so with a not-for-profit entity or a nonprofit corporation in the state of North Carolina, your funding sources are really going to drive what kind of entity you have, because you're going to be a nonprofit corporation in the story. And then it's just a matter of talking about what that looks like. But we're going to focus on for-profit entities today because there's a lot more variance, a lot more opportunity for optimizing what kind of legal setup you have. So that's where we're going to try to focus our conversation today.
Great. So understanding that the facts are really going to sort of dictate where we go and even where we start, what are some of my options for different entity forms?
So that's a good question. And that's usually the second question we get. Once I give them that big long spiel on it depends, which is the classic lawyer answer, they say, okay, great. That doesn't really help me. Tell me what my options are. So let's go, so we can move forward. And this is where a lot of confusion usually comes into a client's mind when they're coming in the first time. A lot of folks, I would say the majority of clients that we deal with are owner operators. We deal with a lot of different clients, but if you're looking at sheer volume of cases that we do, most of them are folks who are forming an entity for themselves to run, or to run with their family, friends, or their partner, and they're going to be actively involved in the business. Usually that person has talked to somebody at some point, and that person that they talked to, whether it's a CPA or a broker or somebody that they've worked for in the past, somebody has heard the terms partnership, limited liability company, or an LLC. In strange circumstances, maybe you've heard about limited liability partnerships, or a really quirky one, limited liability partnerships, but we're not going to get into that one, don't worry. Or corporations. And sometimes you've heard things like S corporation and C corporation. So that's kind of our goal. Once we get an idea of what you want to do with your business, who you're going to be doing it with, what kind of assets you're going to have, where your funding sources are coming from, the next step is to decide, okay, which one of these makes sense for me? And each one of those things that I named, with the exception of an S corporation in North Carolina, are different types of entities that you can actually form by going to the Secretary of State in the state of North Carolina and saying, here I am, I'm forming my business, and this is the kind of business I want to form. And so you've got a lot of choices there, and where you end up going depends on all of those things that we've talked about, but those are your basic choices. You can go and you can form an LLC, a limited liability company. That's easily the most popular these days, especially amongst owner operators, but you can also form a corporation. Those two are the most commonly formed in the state of North Carolina, and less common now, but for most part because they've been replaced in many instances by the LLC. Less common now are partnerships, limited partnerships, general partnerships. If you form a general partnership, you're doing something really funky, or you're doing it on accident. So that's definitely something that if you're heading that direction, you want to talk to a lawyer. But in most cases, our conversations with new clients go in one of two directions. We head toward an LLC, or we head toward a corporation. And which direction we head depends, like Meredith was saying, heavily on the facts and circumstances of that particular client's needs. But regardless of what you're forming, your first step is to go to the Secretary of State and you make a filing with them. And that filing is going to be an set of articles of organization if you're forming an LLC, or articles of incorporation if you're forming a corporation. So those are your options from a state law perspective. And we'll get a little bit into this, but just as a little bit of a preview, what I've been talking about are the entities you can actually form, and go to the Secretary of State and say, I want to form this entity. There's been a lot of talk about things like S corporations, which we'll get into in more detail later, but those types of designations for a company are looking at your legal entity through a different type of lens. So I like to describe it as, you can look at your new entity through your state law lens or your tax law lens. And this is the kind of analogy that only somebody who does something like I do would come up with. But that doesn't make it any less helpful, I think. I think one way to look at it is, what is my entity actually called? It's an LLC or it's a corporation. It's that kind of thing. But the other lens you look at your new entity through is the tax lens. How is it going to be taxed? Am I going to file a return for that new entity? And if so, what kind of return am I going to file? If I make money in that entity, or I lose money in that entity, how's it going to reflect on either that entity's return or my personal returns? And so the types of tax statuses that you see thrown around are partnership, and this is where it gets really confusing because I know I said that that's a corporate state law concept, and it is, but if they didn't make it confusing, people like me wouldn't have a job. You've got partnerships as an option, as well as S corporations, which is a small corporation. Partnerships and S corporations have many similarities. The main similarity being that the operations of the entity and how you make money and how you lose money and how that is taxed pass through to the individual owners. So lots of times you see that with smaller businesses where you've got individuals who want the losses early on for their tax purposes and don't want to pay a second level of tax by being a C corporation. And that's the other type of entity that we usually see through the tax lens. You've got partnerships, S corporations, and then C corporations. C corporations are your classic corporation where the corporation itself pays taxes, it files its own return, and what happens in the corporation is a little bit like Vegas, it stays in the corporation. It doesn't pass through to the owners. So that can be helpful in many ways too. But those are the two different ways we look at it. Those are your options when people ask for our options. You've got options in state law and you've got options in federal taxation. And what your options are for the federal taxation purposes depend on what option you choose when it comes to the state law perspective. So that's where we start with that, and those are what the options usually are.
So that sounds like a lot of options. Are there some limitations if I want to go into business just myself?
Yes, there are. It may not surprise anyone to hear that you can't form a partnership if you don't have a partner. That's really the only one that's off the table, though. If you're an individual and you are getting into a consulting business, you've decided people want to know what I have to say and they want to pay for it. That's great. You can start that kind of business with very little capital, but you might want to form an entity so that you don't have to use your social security number on tax filings with your vendors. And you may want to limit your liability for things like debt that you take out in order to finance, adding new employees or doing something like that. And you may want to have a separate employer identification number, tax ID, for employing people if you grow and it's not just you. So when you start off, and as long as you remain the sole owner of your company, whether you're a corporation or you're an LLC, you really only have two choices when it comes to, or two types of choices when it comes to how you're going to be taxed. You can be an LLC, you can be a corporation, but when you look at the tax part, you're not going to be able to choose to be taxed as a partnership, just like you're not going to be able to choose to form as a partnership because you don't have partners. But you can choose, if you start as an LLC, the default way that you're going to be taxed if you're a single member LLC is that the IRS doesn't even recognize you as a separate taxable entity. And so this is oftentimes where you end up at the very beginning of small operations. It's the simplest way to set up an entity with as little impact as possible when it comes to the tax effect of what you're doing. If you set up a single member LLC, what you're doing is you're saying, here, I'm creating this separate legal entity, and that legal entity can do everything I can do except eat and drink. And I'm not going to ask anybody to tax it differently. I'm not going to have to file a separate return. It makes it very simple for you. Everything that you earn or lose is going to be reported on your individual income tax return, and you get the benefit of limitation of liability with your LLC without having to deal with any additional complications when it comes to taxes. But the other option, if you're a single member, is an option that you have if you've got partners as well, or fellow shareholders if you form a corporation. And that's to choose to be taxed as an S corporation or a C corporation. Both of those are corporations, and the fact that they are taxed statuses, but they're called corporations, which is a term that's used in state law, and I've talked about over the past few minutes, makes it more complicated. But those are your two options really when it comes to being a single owner. You can choose to be disregarded as an LLC, or you can choose to have a non-default tax status, and there may be reasons you choose to do that.
So if I want to go into business with other people, are there any limitations, or are all those choices available to me?
I would say the main limitation is don't go into business with people that you don't trust. Otherwise, you've got pretty much everything on the table. The only thing you don't have is the option to be taxed as a disregarded entity, or rather for your tax status as an LLC to be disregarded for tax purposes, like we were just talking about with a single member LLC. But if you do find folks that you want to get into business with, and you want to have access to your business accounts and sign on behalf of your company and collaborate with you when it comes to the big decisions about your company, then there are a lot of options available to you, with the exception of the disregarded entity. You can form an LLC. Now that you have somebody to call a partner, you can form a partnership, general partnership, a limited partnership, and you can form a corporation, and you can choose any of the tax statuses that are available to those types of entities. And so in most cases where we've got multiple owners in an LLC, or in a corporation, we're choosing to be taxed, if we're an LLC, as a partnership. In most cases, that's where you've got real estate holding company is probably the most common scenario, where you've got real estate, you've got an appreciating piece of property, and you don't want to have to deal with the additional burdens that being taxed as a C or an S corporation come along with, if you're going to form that way. And if you've got multiple folks who are in a business, whether you're an LLC or you're forming as a corporation, but you're going to be operating a company, where you've got accounts receivable, accounts payable, you've got somebody at the till when they come in, and you've got a brick and mortar, and you're running an actual business, that's when you look and you see more likely to be taxed as an S corporation or a C corporation. Those types of tax statuses tend to be where you want profitable operating businesses to be.
So you've talked a lot about S corporations. I've heard a lot about S corporations. How do people form them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I would say most of the time when I have somebody come in and they want to talk about forming an entity, most of them appear to have already made up their mind that they want to be an S corporation. I don't know who's doing the branding for S corporations, because it doesn't seem like they have the money to do it, or organized enough to do it. But whoever is doing the branding for S corporations is doing an incredible job. I would say most folks think this is what I need. And lots of times it's because they talked with a CPA that knows what they're talking about. This kind of goes back to that last example I was talking about, which is if you're forming an entity and you're going to be owning it and you're going to be operating it, being taxed as an S corporation can make a lot of sense. An S corporation bears a lot of similarities to a partnership in that the profits and losses of the company and how those are taxed, the benefits of those losses or the burden of those taxable revenues are going to be passed through the entity to the individual owners. There are some pretty significant differences between S corporations and partnerships, but from a tax perspective, but those are outside of the scope of what we're talking about today. The biggest difference, and the main reason you see people form S corporations as owner-operators in a small business, is that they want to get the benefit of the pass-through of taxation, so they don't have their corporation paying or their LLC paying its own level of tax. But they also want to pay themselves a wage. And there are ways that if you're paying yourself a reasonable but fairly low wage as a W-2 employee of your own corporation, you can save some money on the payroll tax side of the profits that you're making. And if you've got more particular questions about that, I would invite you to follow up after, because if we start talking about payroll taxes, nobody's going to make it through the next 6 minutes. So I'd rather move on from that. But that's the main reason you see S corporations out there. And they can be a very helpful thing for owner operators, but they're not always the right answer. And as we talked about at the beginning, forming an S corporation isn't really something you do. You form an LLC or you form a corporation, and then you choose with the IRS to have that entity taxed as an S corporation. Importantly, you can make that decision when you form the company or after you form the company. It depends lots of times on where you see your revenues starting to hit break even and for your company to be profitable. Many companies will form it as an LLC, get the benefit of pass-through taxation, be taxed as a partnership, which is the default, while they've got losses coming in, if they're putting in enough capital for that to make sense. And then once they get to the point where they're making enough money for it to make a difference, then they make an S election and they go from there.
So how do I know which entity is right for me?
Boy, that's tough. The best way is to talk to somebody like, wow, this is going to sound conceited. Talk to somebody like me, but don't necessarily talk to me. Talk to somebody who knows what they're doing. Lots of times it's helpful to talk to folks that you know who have been through it before. While you may not want to go to a friend who who opened their own shop or owns their own business to actually do the work with you, it can be very helpful to talk to somebody like that, see what their experience was. They may have talked to somebody like me or to a CPA or a business advisor, consultant of some kind. They may have been given good advice or bad, and they've probably got some lessons for you. And that's where most people start. It's a natural place to start. But once you've had that conversation, you've got an idea of what you want to do, it makes a lot of sense to talk to an attorney. Because while the Secretary of State is set up to deal with individuals, I can't tell you how many times I've had to deal with folks who have gone on and done what would make complete common sense if you're not, an attorney, if I'm making these filings with the Secretary of State. But you end up with something that you didn't intend. And that's the easiest, that's the lowest value add that an attorney can give you in the entity selection and formation process. But there's a lot more value there too. It's not just about avoiding mistakes, it's about making sure you maximize what your legal entity can do for you, and that's something that counsel can help you with.
That sounds like maybe a reason people should use a lawyer for this.
Sure, but I guess we're probably biased, I guess.
That's great. Well, I've got one more quick sort of specific question for you, but before I think we're out of time. You may have briefly touched on this, but I've got several friends who are independent travel agents or direct sales reps, and they maybe have been told or they think the only reasons they should consider setting up an entity are to limit liability or for tax reasons. Are they missing anything, or are these the reasons that you would set up an entity?
Those are the main reasons. I wouldn't say they're missing anything big. I think that there are other reasons you might want to form a legal entity. I would say the third main reason behind limiting liability and getting the kind of tax treatment that you want are organizational in nature. One is, that limitation of liability is potentially an enormous picture. As soon as you hire somebody, if you individually hire an employee, you're in a completely different world than you would be if you have a legal entity and you hire an individual. So that one is humongous, and the limitation of liability is by far the main reason, and tax status is easily the second. But the third is usually organizational, and it has a lot to do with something I mentioned before, where you may not want your social security number to be the tax ID for your business. These days, privacy matters a lot. Depending on the state that you form your entity in, you may be able to hide a lot of what your personal information is, your address, your phone number, your email address, even your name sometimes, and your position, from the wandering eyes of the public. And that's usually something that weighs in. It's probably the third most common reason for people to form an entity. Some kind of organizational, so it's privacy, or perhaps you have another entity and you're starting a new division. And so it may be that you want to keep the books separate, which is something you can do internally. But lots of times, if you've got two businesses or two operations that you're doing, a very common one would be, I've got a business and I'm opening up a brick and mortar, and I'm going to go buy the property that I'm going to open the brick and mortar on. I don't necessarily want to have a really valuable asset like land and a building in the same legal entity that I have my operating business. And that kind of goes back to the limitation of liability point, but it's also an organizational one as well. So that's usually the third main reason. I would say the fourth and less common is probably you get to create a fun name. I had a really good name that I kept trying to get clients to do forever. And finally, like a year ago, somebody actually took it. So I've been trying to figure out another fun name. But that's just a thing that I enjoy about it. I do think we were probably out of time. I do appreciate you guys joining us for a few minutes. And thank you, Meredith, for breaking up the monotony of my voice throughout these past 30 minutes. We tried to present you guys with many of the common questions we get, some of the common answers that we give initially. Like Meredith said at the beginning, a lot of what you may want to consider in forming a legal entity comes down to your individual fact circumstances, and that's something you can talk with counsel about. Following this little outro, we'll take a look at any questions in the comments section, and if there are any that we can easily reply to, we'll post those responses and hope that they'll be helpful. But thank you for your time today. We hope this was helpful. If you have this time next week at noon on the 24th, we will be back and we'll be presenting the third installment in our 8-part series. And that will be called What to Know When Buying or Selling a Business. And I gotta say, the presenters are incredible. So you're really gonna want to see that. So thank you again, and hope everyone has an excellent day.